So, hi there again. Sorry, just getting myself into place there. So, if we look at the book of Joshua, we see in the first chapter that Joshua has now become the leader of the Jewish people, and so now he's got a big task on his hands because he's got more than 1 million people under his responsibility. But that's by no means the hardest task he's now facing, because this huge number of people he has to lead into the promised land, and slightly trickily there is already a number of peoples living in the promised land who are not going to be best pleased or best keen to give up their land to the Jewish people, even though God's promised it to them. So he's got a big task ahead. So that's why we see in chapter 1 these words repeated: be strong and courageous. Obviously, Joshua has a hard task ahead and he's going to need a lot of strength and courage. And we also see mentioned here in chapter 1 what the secret of his success will be. In verse 7, I think it is, it says to keep to the law of God and to not turn to the left or right, to meditate on it day and night. So obviously by being close to God's law, by putting it into practice, living it out, this will enable Joshua to be successful, obeying God's commands. And more so than that, we see that when he then goes and talks to or sends the message to the people to get ready, to prepare to go into battle, they respond positively. We see that he's obviously got a lot of authority in their eyes, so much so that at the end of the chapter they even say that anybody who doesn't obey him should be put to death, I think. And more so than that, we see again the secret of his success, or the thing that the people are really trusting in and hoping for, is that God will be with him. And they say, well, if God's with you, then we will obey, because they obviously recognize that this is the secret of success, to have God's presence working for them. We see in chapter 2 then, first foray into the promised land. Some spies going to check things out. They visit Jericho. They meet Rahab in slightly questionable circumstances, but in any case we see here that God can work even in and through unexpected circumstances. Rahab protects them by lying to the men who come to seek them out, and then sends them on their way through the window of her apartment there in the wall, lowering them down. Interesting issue about the lying, and how that although Rahab lies, it's obviously perceived in a good way, and it's obviously for a good purpose. An interesting philosophical moral question there that with another occasion we could think about. In any case, the key thing here is that we see that Rahab, even though she's a member of the heathen people which are given over to distraction, nevertheless we see that by her positiveness and by her trust and protection of these people from God's camp, the Israelites, we see that there is actually a way out of this potential distraction, and that is by this trust and kindness that she shows them. And they then promise her that when they come to destroy the city, if she and her family gather in the house or apartment in the wall there, and they put a red cord in the window, that will then protect them. Obviously this is then a nod to the New Testament, where there's the promise that anybody who's under Jesus' red blood, the protection of that will be saved from God's wrath. But in any way, for the time being, this is just an interesting little sign, which just goes to show that these destructive raids by the Israelites were nevertheless potentially get-outable of. People could actually have a solution to them. Obviously it's an issue, this genocide, as some people say it, but actually if we think about it, this is just the fact that the people didn't repent, and this is just consequences, God's wrath coming upon them, in the same way that for us today. If people don't repent of their sins, there will be consequences. It's quite a hard truth, but that's just the way it is. And we do see there, reading through Joshua, that there are two occasions where people do get out of this wrath: Rahab and her family, and also the Gibeonites, who again by a slightly devious method, but nevertheless they go to the Jewish people, and Joshua managed to trick them into thinking that they're from a far distance away, and by doing that they're able to make peace. That's in chapter 9, again an interesting issue. Some moral questions that we could debate, but the fact of the matter is that Rahab and her family and the Gibeonites get out of the coming wrath, whereas the other peoples there don't seem to repent and don't seem to want to get out of it. Indeed, some of the kings start attacking the Gibeonites in a way to punish them for the fact that they have managed to make peace with the Israelites. In any case, a few more interesting things before we finish. So chapters 3, 4 and 5, we see the Jewish people crossing over the Jordan into the promised land and being circumcised, as many of them hadn't been in the wilderness. Interestingly then, we see here the Jews passing through water in order to establish the covenant, which is made a sign of by the fact that they're all circumcised. Maybe this is an allusion to baptism in the New Testament, being a sign of the covenant as we pass through water. We also see at the end of chapter 5 that the commander of the Lord's army appeared, which is also a reminder that it's actually God who's fighting the battle and it's God who's giving the promised land. Chapter 16 to 13 we see the conquest, the different battles. One interesting thing to note here is that Achan in chapter 7 sounds a bit like an American pop star, but it's actually a Jewish man and his family. Unfortunately, he didn't obey God's command to not take any of the things that were supposed to be destroyed. By taking them and concealing them, it means the next battle in Ai, the Jewish people go there confidently with just a small army, but they're routed, and it's because of this sin. And so unfortunately Achan and his family have to pay the price, after which they then go in chapter 8 to fight the battle again at Ai, and this time they're victorious. And then moving on to chapter 13, we see the different battles and victories that they have, the land they take possession of. But in chapter 13 we find out that actually they didn't manage to take all the land, they didn't manage to get all the peoples out of the promised land. And so this will be a theme going on in the Bible, that the Jewish people, although they're God's perfect people, are constantly being led into sin by the peoples around them. And maybe this is a reminder to us in our Christian life that we're not yet perfect. We still have a lot of sin in and around us to struggle with and fight with in God's power. Chapters 14 to 21, we read about how the land's divided up. Maybe not the most interesting of reading for us and a bit hard to follow and imagine some of the geography there, but nevertheless very important chapters for the Jewish people so that they knew the boundaries and whose land was who. Verses 22 to 24 then, we see the conclusion of the book. We see the people's returning home, and we see Joshua's farewell and renewal of the covenant. In verse 15 there's those famous verses about where Joshua challenges the people to think about which gods they're going to serve once they're settled in this new promised land, and he makes the statement, "But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." This is a verse you see adorning many a household when you go to visit. And then finally in verses 29 to 33 we see the conclusion of the matter. We see Joshua's buried in the promised land, we see Joseph is buried in the promised land, and indeed Eleazar, son of Aaron, is also buried there. So these three figures from the previous time, from Egypt, are all passed away and buried in the promised land, and now we're ready to move on into Judges and to see what the people will do now that they've taken possession of the promised land. But that's for us to talk about another day. Hope this has been helpful. It's certainly been helpful for me, if not for anybody else. So thanks for listening. Bye bye.